introduction. So yeah, I'm Therese. Hi, I'm waving to everybody. I actually presented a version of this presentation at OpEx Week World Summit in January as a workshop format. So as I go through the slides here, you'll actually see some pages that say worksheet on them, and that's why they're actually intended to be a collaborative worksheet format at that point. So that's definitely part of the reason I'm sharing the slides with everybody, so hopefully you can make it a workshop to the extent you'd like to within your own organization. So, and again, as Norval shared, I'm going to talk a little bit about value stream mapping, but really what I'm talking about is the skills that you use in value stream mapping and in your lean body of knowledge to apply those into customer experience. And that's a lot of what I do at LexisNexis. I am a ASQ Black Belt and also a certified customer experience professional, and I really like to combine those disciplines in a way that I apply to improve customer experiences within LexisNexis and for our customers. So that's really my goal today. When we look at value stream mapping, and you know what value stream mapping is, you talk about documenting, analyzing, improving the flow of materials, right? The product or service for the customer. Journey mapping is also looking at documenting, analyzing, improving flow, but here we're talking about improving the flow of your customer's experience as they engage with your company across the lifespan of the customer within your company. So very similarly, you're drawing maps in a similar format, but what you're flowing through is different. With value stream mapping, you would take into account things like the product, but then also the management, the information systems, everything that supports the process. And the analogy to that journey mapping is taking into account the experiences your customer has with your product, with your services, all of the interactions they have across the life cycle. So just definitionally, there's some analogies there. When we look at a value stream map, there's usually this little symbol, right, that looks, I don't know, this jaggedy edge symbol, I guess it's a factory, right, that usually in a value stream map is what represents the customer. It's their bundle of their functional requirements. And when you talk about meeting the functional requirements of the customer, you're really talking about, if this is kind of a version of Maslow's hierarchy, right? You're talking about meeting just their expectations. You might produce satisfied customers. What we're after when we talk about customer experience is really producing loyal customers, and the best group is the customers who will promote for you, who will go out and, in essence, sell for you. So if you think about products like Apple, right, nobody has to tell you to go buy an iPhone. People just know about iPhones. They sell them themselves practically. And so that, if you hold that out as kind of a benchmark, to get to that level, you really have to move beyond the functional requirements and into how do you meet the unrecognized needs, how do you make the emotional connection with your customers. And that's where journey mapping really comes in and customer experience work comes into play. So there's a story here that I like to share briefly, and it's one that you can find out on the internet about an individual called Doug Dietz, and this is kind of a basic story just to give you an idea of what journey mapping is all about and customer experience is all about. So Doug Dietz worked for GE Imaging, and he helped produce this lovely machine, this MRI, right? And was very proud of this machine, put it out into the hospitals, met all the requirements, and if you look at an ad for the machine, it's all about how it meets the hospital's requirements, right? And he went and actually observed the machine in action. He kind of go out and see his baby, see his work product in action, and see how it works. This machine is actually used in children's MRIs, and when he went and observed children going through the MRI machine, what he observed, and there's actually a TED talk on this that I encourage you to go out and listen to because it gives me goosebumps when I listen to it. But if he goes out and he watches children going through this machine, and what he found is that he saw a little girl kind of approaching the machine, and as soon as she sees it, she breaks out in tears. She's just sobbing. And he found that a really high percentage of children having to go through an MRI process need to be sedated to go through it because they need to lay still and they're afraid of this machine. So he went back to the drawing board on what he can do to change his customer's experience, the children's experience, as they use the machine. And he actually met with patients who've gone through MRI and talked about what they enjoy and they don't enjoy. And he mapped out a different experience. And what he did is he reskinned the machine, basically, to look like different adventures, and there's lots of pictures of these. And so now the MRI machine, it's the same exact machine, same exact technology, but it looks like a campsite, or it looks like an aquarium. It looks like different things. He's surrounded them with sensory experiences, with scents and smells and so forth. And the children going through the experience with these machines now have a significantly lower, and I don't remember the numbers honestly, but it goes from like 80% plus sedation rates down to below 5% sedation rates as they go through this machine. The technology is exactly the same. What he changed is the customer's experience. And so that's really the kind of a pinnacle example of what we're talking about when we're talking about taking the approach that you use when you map the flow of your product you're producing, and instead map the flow of your customer through the experience that they have with you and your products, and focus on that as your path for improvement. So definitely look for the TED Talk from Doug Dietz, D-I-E-T-Z. It's a great one to watch and gives you kind of that fundamental background. The other place I tie this into lean a little bit, everybody knows the Gemba walk, right? Going out to the place of the customer. When we talk about customer experience, we want to go out to the real place of the customer as well. And so what we do is we create listening posts for the customer. So you may actually, depending on what your business is, you may actually go out and observe the customer at their place of business. But more often it's things like surveying, capturing feedback when they call into your customer support organization, capturing feedback metrics and so forth around how fast you turn around service to these customers. There's a whole list of metrics that you can capture, but it's really important to establish in listening posts. So part of what we do when we value stream map, or when we customer journey map the customer experience, we know what are the key moments across that journey, and how can we create listening posts in that journey so that we can kind of, in essence, do the Gemba walk with our customers. So one of the first challenges I ask people when they talk about they want to look at the customer's experience, and we look at journey mapping, is first do an assessment of what are the different listening posts you have in place. What are the different surveys or feedback points or different ways that you can capture that listening post data. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but if anyone has follow-up questions on those, I can certainly address those. We all know that bad experiences spread quickly, and this is just a reminder of that. Again, why you're looking at this listening post and making sure that you have them out there, because otherwise you'll miss the feedback, and negative feedback spreads a lot more fast, especially in today's social media world, than positive feedback spreads. So now looking at the map itself, you're probably familiar with most of these kinds of symbols or things similar to it from a value stream mapping foundation. What we do with journey mapping is we use some of those symbols, but if you look around online, there's a lot of different journey maps. It doesn't really matter so much the format you follow. I'm going to show you how I incorporate actually more of these kinds of symbols into my maps. But if you look at journey map, if you just Google journey mapping online, you'll see different formats that people use. The basic elements, though, is we look at the personas of customers. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. The lifecycle stages, the touch points a customer goes through, the thoughts, perceptions, and feelings. And this is where it does get different than value stream mapping for sure, because we get into kind of the squishy space of customer experience, the thoughts and feelings and perceptions of customers. But we make that as data-driven as possible. And then really where some more lean comes in is looking at your journey and identifying where there's wastes and opportunities. So this is an example of one of the journey maps that I've produced that looks more like what you might produce in Visio, what you might produce as a process flow or a value stream flow potentially. It's a little different, obviously, but this is more like it. So we use similar symbols. The squares would be touch points in this case, the different places that a customer interacts with us. And I'll go down through each of these symbols that are on here as we go through. You don't have to use this format, certainly. I'm more interested in the kind of the methodology of how you produce a map as opposed to the exact set of icons. But one thing I have found in our organization is getting an agreement on this is the standard set of icons and format that I'm going to use to produce an actual map. Really helps to standardize that and helps to get the organization understanding the maps and how we can leverage them. So I'll talk through this. And in the example I'm using here, I don't know if you can really see it. It's kind of small. You'll see it in the version we send out. But I've basically created an example here where my customer I'm pretending is someone who is looking for a home security system. And so I have their persona over here, which I'll go through, and then the different touch points that they interact with us. So I'll go through that. I just wanted you to see kind of visually what a journey map might look like. Okay. So the first step, again, is looking at the persona. A persona is different than a customer segment or a segmentation. A persona really is a fictionalized version of your actual customers. So what you do is you look at the different customers that you have, as well as your prospective customers. What is the customer base that you want your customers to be? What are the future customers of your organization? You would do some level of segmentation on that, and then you would produce actually fictionalized customers. So I have someone here who I made up, who's Bob, and you can see some details about him. And so the first thing we do when we're going to journey map is we think, who are our actual customers, and we do create those personas. Those serve a couple different values. In the journey map itself, they're a reference point to say, okay, it kind of makes it real, right? It says this person who is in this scenario, here are the things they're concerned about, here are the things they think about day in and day out, and it kind of brings it home. And it also reminds us that we may need to journey map the same experience through multiple paths. So in other words, if I have someone who fills one persona, they may have one set of experiences. A very different persona, and it could be generational, it could be demographic, there could be lots and lots of differences, but a very different persona may have a very different experience with this. They may engage with the company differently. Someone who's a millennial is not likely to pick up a phone and call your customer service organization. So how do they get their issues resolved versus someone who's a Generation X person who is more comfortable picking up the phone and calling for assistance. So the way an issue is resolved may be very different. That's going to cause a very different relationship with those customers. So that's where kind of personas comes into play. After I define my personas, then I look at my life cycle stages. So this is the major points that a customer goes through when they're going down their journey. I've created some generic ones here. These are kind of the minimum. You may have other life cycle stages as well. We actually use a 6-cycle stage here at LexisNexis. But basically, there's something to do with when do they first become aware of a need. It may not be an awareness of your company. It may just be aware of a need, and they're starting to explore options. Then there's something along the lines of making an actual purchase or engaging with you organizationally. Then there's the life cycle that they have of actually using your products or services. And then at some point, are they going to renew? Are they going to repurchase? Can you upsell to them? Can you expand the wallet share and so forth? So there's different stages that you go through. And when you journey map, you first do it ideally at a macro level where you're looking across that whole life cycle. And then you may dive in deeper and do specific areas. So if you think of like a value stream map, you might do a value stream map of the whole flow of a product through production, and then you may hone in on different areas and do kind of a micro map of the more specifics in certain areas, and you would do the same thing here. Once you have those life cycle stages, then you get into the customer touch points. So, and actually I'm going to skip to the next slide that gives an example of this, but basically you're looking at are there differences by persona, and what are the different touch points that happen? What are the different ways the customer experiences with you? So an example of a touch point here might be someone contacting your service desk if they need, how you go to a product and you're always constantly having to reset your password. I never remember my password for any website. So that, every time I have to reset my password, that is a touch point with the company. Some companies, when you have to reset your password, you click a link and you do it on the page. Sometimes you have to get a code texted to your phone and plug that code in to validate that it's you, and then you go through that way. Some organizations, you have to call their customer service line and get a password reset. So what are the different ways that a customer interacts with you with that example? And you imagine all the different, you actually do an inventory of all the different touch points that they go through. The other icons that I'm using here that are important for the journey, and you wouldn't have to use these exact icons, but the pieces of them you want to convey. So for that touch point, this black arrow pointing kind of downwards, this is telling me who initiated the touch point. So is this something that the customer initiates towards me, or is this something that I, as the organization, initiate contacting the customer? You want to notate what the purpose of that interaction is, and that should be from the customer perspective, just like we would do when we're tracing value through a system. We want to make sure that the value is being determined according to the customer, right? So what is the customer's purpose in this touch point? What are they trying to achieve? And I have a set of icons here where this says I'm trying to resolve an issue. It might be educational, it might be purchasing things, something transacting, etc. But what is the purpose that they're trying to achieve? What's the channel or the mechanism that they're using to interact with you? This could be something like a phone call or an email or a chat. It also could be someone actually using your product. That is an interaction itself as well. The touch point is the actual usage of the product, or going to your website, receiving self-service through some means. All the different ways, again, that the customer can interact with you, your company, your product. Accessing information on a social media site that's about your company would be a touch point. So you inventory all of these touch points and define these different aspects of them. Who's initiating them, why, how, and if it is interacting with an internal department, function, or product, what are they interacting with? Okay. The next thing we do within each of those touch points is we talk about bringing some customer insights in it. Remember I mentioned listening posts before. So I want to know at each of these touch points, this starts to get to a little bit of the analysis of the touch point. How well are we doing with that? Maybe what's the satisfaction level? Are there complaints about it? How do we know that thing? So is there survey data we have? Is there a CRM, a tool we're using to capture information about that customer, that we know how satisfied or dissatisfied they are? And then there's a concept in customer experience and journey mapping called moments of truth. And what that is this touch point something that's critical? Is it something that if this goes right, that makes the customer happy, not just happy, but really, really loyal? Or if this goes wrong, they're going to go out and spread that bad word of mouth. So if you think about yourself at maybe like a restaurant, right? Depending on your own proclivities, getting the right order, getting the right food is probably a moment of truth. Now, you might care more or less whether your steak is done exactly to the right temperature or not, so that may or may not be a moment of truth for you, but getting your food is a moment of truth, right? Having it be on clean dishes is a moment of truth. Things like whether the waiter was friendly with you might be for some personas, might not be for others. So again, this is where you have to know your customers, know what matters to them, have those listing posts out there. But the moment of truth is really where you'll start to dig in and do improvements and make sure that those moments of truth are the things that you're prioritizing as the most important things that you improve. Because ultimately the reason your customer journey mapping is to look for opportunities to improve your customer journeys. Okay. I go into metrics here because we're talking about things like satisfaction and complaints and so forth. And so when you think about how do you know how satisfied you are and whether this is a moment of truth, this is where you do want to have listing posts and you do want to have metrics and data in place. So some of the customer metrics, and these isn't meant to be kind of a complete body of all metrics by any means. It's just some of the key customer metrics that are useful in this space. A common one is NPS, or Net Promoter Score, and I believe we've seen some recent communications around NPS where ASQ actually has used NPS internally as well. But NPS is really a simple question. It's how likely are you to recommend X, whatever X is, my company, my products, my services. It's a 0 to 10 scale. It's not a 10-point scale. It's an 11-point scale. It goes from 0 to 10. And within this scale, the 0 to 6s are considered detractors, people who would actively go out and potentially maybe post something on social media bad about your product or service. 7s and 8s are passives. They might be satisfied, but they're not going to go out and rave about your company and your product. And 9s and 10s are promoters. And the way that they calculate NPS is they take the percentage of promoters and you subtract from that the percentage of detractors. So if you've done a survey and 50% of your people are promoters and 35% of detractors, you have an NPS of 15. It's a little bit of an odd calculation because it's subtracting two percentages and expressing it as a whole number, but that is how the scale actually works. So if someone has an NPS of 15, that means that they have 15 points higher on the promoter scale than on the detractor. And you can improve your scale by moving passives to promoters or by moving detractors to promoters. So if you have fewer detractors or more promoters, basically. So even a detractor to a passive improves your scale. And that can be measured at transactional level or a relationship level. So what I mean by that is if you have a customer service type organization and they run a survey after they talk to somebody over the phone or they chat with someone, you can send a survey after that that talks about how likely are you to recommend our product based on that interaction with our customer service agent. That's transactional NPS. It's talking about a specific interaction. If you instead do maybe like an annual survey where you say, based on all the experiences you have with our products or services or people, would you recommend us? That's more of the relationship survey. So there's different ways this can be captured. And so if you have your listing post, you might have a transactional survey after a key moment of truth that asks a question like how likely you are to recommend and gets a transactional NPS for that moment of truth to tell you how well you're doing at that point. So those are the kinds of measures you'd put in place. And this is just for reference. I won't go into it, but just to give you some idea of what NPS scores look like across different industries and some benchmarks there. Amazon usually comes out at about a 60 on the NPS scale. So that gives you an idea. That's considered a high performer. Okay. Another customer metric that you could bring into your mapping to quantify how well you're doing would be a customer effort score. Let's see, is there a reason it's a numeric? I didn't get that whole question that passed it up. I don't know, Norval, if you're tracking the questions that are texting in. I couldn't read the whole thing as it passed up there. So the customer effort score is based more on to what extent do you agree with a statement. So this is usually a Likert scale. A 1 to 5, and it's percent top 2 box are considered positive results. So this is it's kind of somewhat of a parallel to NPS. Some companies use customer effort instead of NPS. At Lexis, we actually use both of these measures. This is usually a transactional survey metric. Customer satisfaction, similar to customer effort, just a different question here. How satisfied are you? And it's a 1 to 5 Likert scale. So again, what I'm trying to accentuate here is making sure that you're quantifying how well you're doing at those different touch points, especially the moments of truth, in terms of something that really is measured from a customer perspective. First-time resolution or first contact resolution is another one, although actually second contact avoidance is better than first contact resolution. So how well did I resolve the issue? Did I resolve it? And really, I like to challenge people with, all of those metrics, FCR, CSET, CSs, those ones that I just rattled through, those all assume that some issue has occurred and some question has happened. There's been a reason to have an interaction. And really, when you're looking at it from a customer experience perspective, you want to think about how to measure the issue avoidance. How do you measure delivering a service without the customer even realizing it? So that's really more of just something to ponder there, but a question to think about when you're assessing and quantifying your map. What are ways that you can measure, if you look at those touch points, what are ways where you can measure not having to have as many touch points? If you don't want to have the customer having to call you for assistance or reach out to you for assistance, or you don't have to have products returned to you, how do you have the avoidance of it? And it gets into prevention, right? The next thing I look at is analyzing more from somewhat of a lean perspective, and this is just a pretty simplistic, really, but looking at it with some basic thoughts in mind. I look for waste at my touch points, again, from the customer perspective, of course, and then I use just the icon of the Kaizen burst to identify opportunities. So when I'm looking at waste, I go through the actual, I use the downtime acronym, I go through the actual waste and say, okay, for each touch point that's happening from that customer perspective, is this something that has to happen? Is the customer wasting time here? Is the customer having to go through unnecessary movements, not just in the way we're delivering the product to them, but how the customer themselves are progressing through the path that we're having them go through as they interact with us. And so this, let me see if I can make this bigger here, if you bear with me. If I look at this map, hopefully you can see that a little more clearly to make it bigger here. I've actually appended each of the stages with the waste icon if I think there's a waste here. So here I'm saying, oh, at this touch point, I'm requiring a home visit to do what I need to do. That has to be scheduled during normal business hours, so there's a time consideration, and the customer may have to miss work for that. And so am I wasting the customer's time? Can I avoid that interaction? If I think about the hours of business we have and what we're putting the customer through in terms of hours of business, do they have to talk to someone through a channel they don't want to? Is that motion that they don't want to go through or shouldn't have to go through? So I actually tag, I have little icons here that I tag each of the opportunities and try to associate the touch point and the opportunity actually to the extent possible with whether that's representing some kind of a waste for the customer. Bear with me. You send that back to the back. This is what happens when I alter my slide deck on the fly. Let me just get rid of that for a moment. Okay. And so here's just kind of a subset blown up bigger, just another example. So there may be time waste, there may be paperwork that has to happen because we're requiring it that doesn't need to happen. And so again, I append the touch points. And so a touch point that's tagged as a moment of truth and then also has a waste associated with it, as well as opportunities, is one I would prioritize for a fix. When I'm journey mapping, I'm also looking below the line and above the line. What this represents is when you think about a value stream map, most of what you're putting into that map is not really visible to the customer. They're impacted by it because they receive the output, but the actual way you're processing through isn't necessarily visible to the customer. That's in customer experience world considered below the line. It's the internal processes, tools, etc., that you have to go through to impact the output. The above the line is the things that are actually visible to the customer and the things they actually experience. So your journey map focuses on this above the line, and the analysis of what to improve and where the opportunities lie is really focused on this above the line. To make the improvements, you usually have to dig in below the line and look at, maybe the causes of why the different pain points are happening on the customer above the line are caused by things that we do and require below the line. And so a lot of the improvements you do happen below the line, but they have to input that out. They have to affect that output of the above the line. Okay. And then the last part, you have to make sure of when you create a journey map, it's not for the sake of creating a journey map. Just like you went to a brown bag study and produce a VSM and just put it out there in the world, you want to go and make some improvements from it. So once you've identified and prioritized your opportunities, you do want to create an action plan with timelines and so forth and measurements around it. The different actions that you identify to take, go through and consider which ones of these are quick wins, which ones require kind of a whole project behind them. You may have to study or investigate further or get approval on, or just consider for the future. But I'll go through, if I look at this, the journey maps back here, for every time I've identified a pain point or an opportunity, I put it into the action plan and I tag it with one of these action types. It's not that I'm going to take immediate action on every single one of them. I'm going to prioritize and pick and choose which ones I'm going to take action on. But everything should be appended with some kind of action type, even if it's just consider for the future. And then I set up a continuous improvement cycle on my journey map. So I usually run a cross-functional workshop. I've brought all the people together. I've mapped the journey based on their involvement, and that's a piece that I didn't accentuate at the top. But the actual dynamic of how you're producing that journey map, you don't want, just like you wouldn't do a value stream map kind of sitting at your desk alone in a closed office. When you're producing it, it's best to walk the walk, right? When we're talking about Gemba walk, with the customer experience, with the journey map, you want to have those listing post data informing the map, and you want to walk the walk and bring in the front line, bring in the people who work the different processes, who actually touch the customer, who actually interact with the customer, and do this in a cross-functional way. You can do brown bags, sticky notes, just like you would do in other methods. Get it digitized at some point for reference, but you would do that kind of cross-functional work. So you've done that, you've identified your improvements, you've kicked off your improvements, and you're managing them. You want to go back through and you want to update your journey map at least once every other year. If your product is very stable and your processes are very stable, that's kind of a minimum. Definitely anytime there's a significant change, but that produces that continuous cycle. And so you would go back again and circle right on back through it. And I know I kind of flew through some of those items, and I think there's at least one question coming up in the, let me see if I can access it, in the WebEx here. So I want to see what other questions you guys have.
Yeah, it looks like one question is in the chat box here, Therese. I don't know if you're able to see it or not.
Now I can, yep. I found it.
Okay.
So is there a reason for using a numeric scale? How often does the organization's customer view the selection? Oh, okay, yeah. So that's going back to NPS. Thanks, Thomas. Selection of 8 with the same meeting. So yeah, there's a few aspects to that. Let me go back to that scale. I think when you're saying is it a reason for using a numeric, honestly, I think what you're referencing there is the 15 as opposed to saying, say, like 15% or a different format there. That really, there's no strong reason other than just ease of comparison of, seeing a number. People understand 15 better. They understand 15%. It's not really a great reason other than that. But when you look at the scale, you're absolutely right. One of the feedback points we get when we start to manage people and programs with an NPS scale, people will say, well, when I respond to a 0 to 10 survey and I answer 7 or 8, that feels like a positive score to me. So why is that passive, and why does that kind of almost count against me? And, are really interpreting 8 the same way. A little bit of is it a mix. You're going to have some people interpret, anytime you do a survey, some people interpret answers differently. But really what I would accentuate here is that this is a survey about loyalty and not about satisfaction. So 7s and 8s may be satisfied. They may be content with the product you're delivering to them, with the service they're receiving, but they're not out there raving about it. If you think about how satisfied you are, you can walk away and be happy with it, but not go and tell 10 friends about it. So that's why the scale is so aggressive, and the 9s and 10s are all the way up in the promoters. I would caution that as you're using this globally, kind of culturally, there's different types of cultural considerations that come into play. So, for example, in our Asia Pacific space, we don't tend to rely as heavily on NPS because in Asia, they will tend to look at the surveys and not score different increments. They interpret the surveys differently and tend to do that. So you do want to use a little bit of awareness of your customer base and how they're kind of likely to interpret, especially culturally and geographically. There are definitely differences there. I hope that helped. You said as you continue to evolve the map, how important it is to use the same questions. Yeah, that's a good point. I definitely think it's important to use the same questions again so that you have that baseline and compare to. Now, it may evolve to some degree. As you refine, you may have to modify the questions a little bit to continue to get actionable data. But you do want to be able to have that reference point and compare back, and hopefully that answers that question. If it doesn't, you'll text in again and let me know. What method was used to determine the customer life cycle? Yeah, so really the customer life cycle, I'm trying to go to my life cycle stage here. The customer's life cycle, Generically, it's going to be the same no matter what your industry is. Generically, it's going to be there's an awareness, there's some agreement, whether it's a purchase or just an engagement with the company. There's some level at which you'll continue to engage with the product or the company, and then there's some level at which you'll either re-engage or repurchase or won't. We'll decide not to walk away. So it's fairly generic. To look at your stages, what I would do is actually start to think about how does the customer actually interact with you. So for Lexus, for example, for my company, we've separated the using the product into kind of two different pieces that internally we call two different things. One is the product usage, and one is how we support the person using the product and how we resolve issues. And the reason we separated it is because functionally, internally, there's different groups responsible for those different pieces, and so the actions would be followed through differently. So we started with the customer and what is the customer experience, but then we know we want to use the map to drive internal actions. So then we also looked at it from a functional perspective of, how will we actually manage these actions and give this feedback back. I don't know if that helps. Hopefully that helps clarify a little bit there. If there's follow-up questions, if I haven't answered those questions correctly or fully for you, go ahead and let me know. And let me know if there's any other questions. Oh, something came through. There tend to be a difference in the customer's data. Yes. Yeah, Thomas, that's a really good point. So when we talk about the data, and it will depend on your industry and your product, I'm sure, but we do look at the data with different levels of segmentation, and part of that comes into the personas. So, for example, one of our personas might be not just age or demographic, but it could be a brand new customer. We look at things, our initial purchase and this kind of getting started. We actually have a stage in our life cycle that we introduced called Getting Started. That is the first 180 days of our customers being with us. Because when we looked at our data and we looked at our survey results and we looked at our actual usage results of the products, and not all of it was that survey type data. Some of it is the actual, we could tell when someone signs onto the product and how many times they run searches and what results they get, that kind of thing. So actual usage data. When we looked at that, we absolutely saw different patterns and different experiences and different feedback, depending on if it was someone within their first roughly 180 days versus someone who's more tenured, so to speak, in our product. And so we segmented it accordingly, and we track our data accordingly. So yes, definitely something to look at. If you start to look at it and you don't see a difference, if a person experiences the same thing or virtually the same thing, whether they're new or using it continually, then maybe you don't need to continue to segment that. But definitely looking for those kinds of differences. You also asked for with another organization. So yeah, one of the things that we do with NPS, and I think that's part of what you're hammering in there, with NPS, we not only run an NPS survey for our customers, but you might want to consider doing a blind survey where you capture data about some of your key competitors as well. So, if you do it as a blind survey, you can get results on yourself in comparison to your competitor, and start to look at, how that looks, as well as looking at which customers maybe have moved from a competitor to you or vice versa. You can start to drive into some of that data as well. Depending, again, on your industry and how easy it is to survey your customers, you may be able to get that.
Hey, Therese, this is Norval. Yeah. I'm seeing questions coming through privately here in Stanton. You probably aren't able to see them.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and tell you what the questions are.
Perfect.
There's a couple of questions here from John. Let's see. He says, you have an NPS of 15. What is the value? If I had to explain this to an upper manager, they would look at myself saying, does this convert to a percentage or a ratio? Like an NPS of 10 mean marginally 1 out of 10 would purchase more?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question, really. So you can't, because it's a calculation where you're subtracting your detractors from your promoters, and the passives are part of the percentage calculation here, when you say percent promoters, percent detractors, but they're not part of the subtraction math that's happening here. So you couldn't take your 15 or your 10 or whatever the case may be and say, oh, a 15 means, 15 out of every 100 customers promote us, because that's not necessarily what it means. This actually has said 50% are promoters. So, and this math, you could get to that score of 15 with lots of different numbers, right? It doesn't have to be 50 and 35. So it doesn't translate quite that cleanly. There are the things that you can do with it. One of the things is you can look at your industry and what the average and benchmark performance is for your industry. And so you can talk about, because NPS is a really widely used survey. So you could talk about, I'm an auto dealer, my NPS is, I'm not an auto dealer, I'm just making this up, but my NPS is 15, and I'm an auto dealer, and the average in the industry-wide survey of 10,000 consumers here was about a 43, with a benchmark, a high of being 58. Well, that means I'm below my industry. My competitors are likely beating me, right? And so I want to do something about that. So as a benchmark, it's useful. It's a metric that's used so widely that it's one that you can get benchmark information on and compare fairly easily by going out and getting the comparative data. The other value, though, and this is a challenge, it's something you have to work through within your organization, the other value is associated more directly with the retention rates or the repurchase rates, the wallet share, connecting it to your financial metrics. So, for instance, what we do is we look at our promoters, our detractors, and our passives, and we look at the promoters, how often do they renew with us? How often are we able to successfully upsell to them, where we increase the wallet share we have with them, where they purchase additional products from us? And look at that same kind of information across detractors and passives, and you can get a lifetime value, a dollar value of a promoter is worth X number of dollars in their lifetime. Here's how much money a promoter is likely to spend with me in my lifetime, or their lifetime. And here's what a detractor looks like, and here's what a passive looks like. As soon as you've done that, sometimes very challenging analysis to figure out the connection to your dollars, to your bottom line, then the NPS becomes extremely powerful, because you could say, okay, for every 2 points I gain in NPS, here's the likely impact to revenue on that, because if I can move people to promoters, they're worth more than they are detractors. So that's where the financial kind of the bottom line comes in. And that's a challenging thing to do depending on the state of data in your organization. So which insurance company got the 66? Let's see. I don't know if I know that. Dave, if you email me, I can see if I could track down that information for a time, because I'm not sure. I pulled the survey off a Temkin group, which is a good customer experience group that has data out there. That's out there publicly, actually. I think in the article they do note which company that is. I'll just have to look it up.
Hey, Therese, there's another question here from John.
Yep.
Okay, from a DMAIC aspect, is there any measurement error uncovered from your NPS scale in your experience?
In the scale itself, not in the way we've applied. I'm thinking here, because you could, like, if you think about the measurement system that you're using, if it's not used, so here's an example. I don't know if this is quite where you're going or not, but we have a customer onboarding program internally, and we were capturing NPS at a customer level, where a customer, I'm in a business-to-business environment, so an individual customer might be a company, and they might have many users inside that company. And so we were measuring it at a customer level and trying to take action and so forth on that. And when we started trying to make improvements and use the data and so forth, we determined that the system itself wasn't giving us the correct actionable data, and we had to actually change not the survey question, but the way we were using the data to where we moved it from customer level to a user level, and actually improved the measurement. I'm not saying we improved the result, the number per se, but improved the accuracy of the measurement, the meaningfulness of the measurement in that sense, and actually improved the metric itself, and then we're able to use it more. Now, the other angle on that is we definitely use the kind of the body of the different customer experience metrics here within DMAIC projects regularly, which isn't quite what you were asking, I know, but we do use that regularly. So we might say the customer effort score or the first time resolution score or the NPS score of a certain segment or a certain type of transaction is X. And we use that as a baseline metric, and then run a DMAIC, run a Six Sigma project even within that, sometimes Lean, sometimes Six Sigma, sometimes a little both, and improve the result. So it's a metric used within our projects regularly. Error in the scale could happen with customer. Yeah, Thomas, you're absolutely right. The error in the scale, that's where I was talking about. Culturally, if you know your customers, certainly in some cultural areas, and that is a good point, we don't use the NPS scale as much because we know that they'll never give us a 9 or a 10, because they just don't culturally. Now, even within just the U.S. base, we'll have certain customers who will write verbatim comments in, who will say things like, I gave you an 8 because I don't promote anybody. I'm not going to give you a 9 or a 10 because I don't promote anybody. I don't believe in doing word of mouth. I don't consider that an error. At that point, they aren't a promoter because they're not promoting me. So I actually accept that as a correct score. But you're absolutely right that if you have a customer base that isn't going to give you a 9 or a 10 because that's their kind of belief system, then that does impact the way you would use it for sure.
Okay, Therese. Barb has a question. Barb's question is, who functionally would best take ownership of this process? Does marketing or quality or design have more skin in the game?
That's a really political question depending on your organization. I can speak for myself a bit on that. In my organization, the customer experience group that I'm a part of actually stands separately. We report into operations at a high level, but we are not marketing, we are not customer service, we're not product development, we're not any of those functions. We actually are kind of our own function to remain objective, and we pull together functional people, the subject matter experts, the SMEs, and the different functions that are able to speak to the processes and the experiences and so forth. So that, to me, is very valuable to have that kind of objective, almost outsider type view. But there are lots of organizations where customer experience is part of the customer support group, customer service organization, or the marketing organization, or any number of other organizations, the quality organization, and so forth. Again, to me, I bring the quality people into the workshops. They own taking action. So if you look at that action plan, they would own some of the actions, but I separately kind of oversee the whole, if that makes sense. But you definitely want each of those functions involved, and I know that's a kind of a squishy answer. This is where my law background comes in, and I try to say it depends on everything. But on this one, it does depend a little bit. It's a very non-answer. Sorry, Norval.
No worries. I'm looking here in the chat box. I don't see any other questions, at least not from this side. I don't know if you have any other questions that may have been sent to you privately.
I think I've hit the ones I've seen come through. Oh, and Polly actually answered one for Dave. Thanks, Polly. That makes sense. USAA as the insurer. Someone had asked the company for which insurance company got the 66 NPS. So that is USAA. Thanks, Polly. I'm crossing off that I have to go look that up.
Let's see, we have still a couple of minutes left before we hit the top of the hour. One person did also send a chat asking if the slide deck was going to be available afterwards, and the answer is yes. We will include that information along with the link to the survey asking about how things went today, as well as the link to the recording of today's webinar, which will be on YouTube. So we'll have all that information together. If anybody has any questions that they want to get in here in the last minute or so, you're welcome to do so. As we wait here momentarily, I'm going to remind everybody once again that our last webinar for March will be next Tuesday, the 20th. It will be with Ron Snee. He will be talking about quality by design. So we still have space available. If you still want to register for that, you're more than welcome to do so. Therese, I'm not seeing any other questions come across.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Therese, for giving this talk today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us once again. We appreciate your patronage, and we will, like I said, be back on Tuesday, 12 noon Eastern Time, which will be the 20th. Until that time, we'd like to wish everybody a good rest of the day, and we'll see you hopefully on Tuesday. Bye now.